Well, hello, Will Ruddick, over there in Kenya, Africa. I'm so happy to be talking with you about your new book, Grassroots Economics. So, welcome.
Thanks, David. Big fan of all your work and pro-social and everything. So wonderful to be here.
I've been hearing about you from multiple people actually for quite a while, and but we've started interacting intensively just over the last few weeks. And so I've read your new book and poured over your website, and I've thrown a lot of stuff at you. So we have a lot to talk about, and we'll center it on your book. But first, just introduce yourself as a person and your foundation of the same name, Grassroots Economics.
So yeah, I'm Will Ruddick. I left the U.S. in 2008 with the Peace Corps. Before that, I was a physicist studying high energy physics, and I kind of fell into what was called econophysics back at the time while doing my master's degree in physics, and I kind of fell in love with using math to sort of understand what economics was. It was an amorphic concept to me. To me, it was something, the last thing I thought I would ever be interested in. Um, and that kind of love for economics, which kind of turned into more stewardship, resource management, morphed from kind of community currency systems into commons over the last, 15 years or so into a very kind of much more deep focus on commoning different practices for common pooled resources and resource coordination within groups, and then connections between groups and kind of pulling that into a protocol language that we can sort of implement or express in different environments. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically we have physics, we have traditional societies, we have modern digital technologies, all wrapped up into one, which is incredible. A little bit about your foundation before we launch onto your book, and
Yeah.
how your book is maybe some kind of culmination of what you've been doing with the Grassroots Economics Foundation.
Yeah, so as I said, I fell in love with alternative economic theories. The first book I read was on this was Bernard Leotar's Future of Money, which is kind of a taxonomy of all different sort of community currency practices around the world. And so that was sort of the introduction to it. And around, when I moved here, after being in the Peace Corps, I started a small foundation that would basically its goal was to research economic practices from the grassroots, like understand how people were doing or organization. And a lot of my first work here was to take practices that I saw happening in Brazil, like Bancos Palmas or in Curitiba, um, and see if that could be possible here. So I was, doing research, showing videos to people in the field here, and I was working a lot in urban slums at the time. And I got a, very resounding like, oh yes, we can try that. And so we would create paper bills that were essentially the local currency systems. And that was sort of the framing was around monetary economics and that, people could take ownership over monetary systems themselves. That's a framing that sort of has evolved into common pooled resources and to think about those things as monetary like units as commitments in general. We talk about like gift cards, for instance, or even money as a commitment of the state. So Grassroots Economics Foundation started as that. It's a nonprofit foundation. It's based here. We don't do any employment, but we work through the systems that we build up. So we have a network of about 100 trainers of trainers around Kenya that go and work with different groups and teach them how to basically take their indigenous or ancient practices and turn them into kind of federated circles of common pooled resources amongst each other and exchange and do a lot of stuff that they have trouble doing when there is no money system. So
And is
yeah,
this taking place outside of Kenya?
yeah, as of like this year, we started publishing our tech as open source on the open web now. So there's a website called sarafu.network, and people in Ukraine are starting to use it quite a bit. There's groups in the US as well. There's groups in South America. So they're starting to be, I think we're in, over 20 countries now where people are just starting to use the tools. There's a learning process and a lot of the user experience is stuff that we're sort of upgrading because the way have done it in Kenya for years and years was on feature phones. So we'd have little SMS-based systems, right? And that were very simple and very kind of close to like e-money systems that people are used to here. So building out sort of a credit interface, like a community credit kind of interface across these different communities. That's been sort of the challenge of this year. And but so far so good. We have little things I'll show you, like little bracelets and like these types of like NFC card chips and stuff like that that people can actually just swipe and use as a credit card now. And that credit is their access to a common pooled resources, right? And those common pooled resources can also bridge across to other federated networks as well. So you have something like a credit network, that's grounded in commitments for goods and services.
Yeah, it's just amazing how you've adapted this to any context, one in which there's very low tech, just availability of the devices is low. But nevertheless, if just one person has a device, then you work with that and then you make that work. And so
Yeah.
it's just amazing what I've what I've what I've learned. Well, what's the goal of your book, and then we'll launch into its organization. So the book specifically, what would be your dream future for the for the book, for the impact of your book?
Yeah, for me, it's trying to find common language at sort of a protocol kind of basis set language for economics, right? Like, how can we describe resource coordination systems in as simple framework as possible that's functionally able to be a mechanism to produce commons. So for me, it's just like, can I work with an Islamic Waqf, like an Islamic endowment? Can I work with an indigenous group or a Christian fellowship or a credit union or a small bank and use the exact same functional mechanisms, the same protocol language, and build up from that to reach those things. And as a physicist, that's sort of my goal always in physics was what are those basic mechanisms? What are those functional mechanisms? What are the fundamental forces, if you will, of resource coordination systems in a functional lens? And I've read a lot of your work and Eleanor Ostrom, and I there's this taxonomy of so many things that enable commons to happen, but I was lacking or felt like I needed a language for functional mechanism to link those things together. And
Yeah, let me just insert that one thing that Lynn Ostrom stressed again and again was the difference between the functional design principles, which are general, and their implementations,
yeah,
which are highly contextual.
yeah,
And so you're in search of implementations that which is all important. And I mean, she would say that there's no one size fits all. This is not a cookie cutter solution. Every community
yeah,
must tinker with its arrangements. That's the kind of thing that she would stress. It's not a panacea. Um, and I guess that'll become relevant here because in some sense you are trying to create a general framework. And I just wondered what's the room for tinkering and tailoring and any particular any particular community. Maybe you could just address
yeah.
that issue.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's the fun of it in a sense. It's like, okay, great, here's a general mechanism and vocabulary. Does that apply to this situation? And I find that to be quite fun and a fun challenge to do. And so far, so good. I really haven't found any situations that I can't apply that to. And of course, when we get into those functional mechanisms, we can say, okay, well, there's a lot of room within those to express them. And you think of it like a
Yeah,
gene being expressed into, I mean, we express those into blockchain, right? So, what is the mechanism or the environment in blockchain that can actually even hold those types of agreements and those mechanisms
yeah.
together? So definitely there's a lot of, like E.O. Wilson would call it, like EU sociality or something, what are those, environments that enable collective action to happen and health and thriving ecosystems. So, yeah.
Okay, well, let's walk through the reflections. Your book is divided into two parts. Part one, reflections, part two, practice. And reflections, six of them, ecosystems, ancestral wisdom, base protocols, protocol expressions, the language of coordination, digital ecosystems, and a path forward. And it's a cruel thing to do. Well, they ask you to zip through those so fast. But if you would, if you could provide a guide to your six reflections, beginning with ecosystems, and then
Mm,
I'll offer some light commentary. But for the most part, I'd like you to channel your book into our
okay.
audience, and then I'll insert some
Okay.
things here and there.
Yeah. The reason I started with ecosystems is because, like I work in a lot of in permaculture, in a lot of work around like syntropic agroforestry. And when you're trying to create systems where there's like guilds of plants that like each other, right? That what's really happening there and what's happening under the soil. So there was a lot of just kind of trying to pull out. I've actually built a little video game around this too of like how do plants actually share nutrients in different ways, and especially through things like mycorrhizal fungi, right? So that there's this system, this living system, mycorrhizal fungi, that actually enables all kinds of different nutrient flows. Um, what is that? And a lot of it's just pattern recognition here. We're just looking at patterns for how resources are coordinated in living systems. And so I thought, nature is a good grounding for it. It should be, we should definitely be able to take lessons out of nature. I mean, our own bodies, metabolisms, right? Metabolic processes. So I felt like that was a good place to start kind of pulling out, what are these processes? Because we tend to have it in our minds that everything economic is purely social, right? Like that it's just rule following, abstract rules and whatnot. But it's like, well, are those actually anchored into living systems? Are those the same protocols really? So yeah, that's that. And then what do I get into next? Remind me, David.
It's traditional systems. It's
Oh, yeah, 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 okay, yeah. So in that case, it's looking at similar
ancient
practices.
wisdom. What did you call it? You
Yeah,
called it ancestral wisdom.
thank you, thank you. So, within community groups, and this is really the revelation for me in the last about 6 years was that um, the practice has a name, and I really didn't even know these names before. So Mweria in Kenya, Minka in South America, in general, like rotational labor association in academia, you'll see this. And basically, this seems to be the economic system that everyone lived by on the whole planet, which was
Yeah,
shocking
yeah.
to me.
Let me
Yeah,
jump in. I mean, because
yeah,
I think this is the ancestral society, and all the way back to human origins,
yeah,
hunter-gatherer societies today, and presumably in our ancestral past, all the way up to the present. This is like
yeah, yeah,
the foundational ancestral society
yeah.
that we're dealing with.
Yeah, everywhere. And every culture across the planet, you'll find some language going back to this. Even like the original term, like alone, for instance, a lien on land. These were non-monetary, relational economic systems. And when you read a lot of anthropology, for me, like Maus, for instance, he would talk about gift economies. He would go out and say, these people are just in some sort of, I mean, he would acknowledge some form of like long-term reciprocal systems, like the birds and the trees. They're reciprocal somehow, but you can't tell actually how that's happening. It's just so large of reciprocity cycle, you can't see it. Well, and that was it. So, coming here to Kenya for 10 years, oh, I lost you there. I'm back. Like I was coming in with this lens of currency, community currency, yada, yada, yada. And those systems were really sort of like trivialized in my mind. And even in the culture, they had sort of been framed as silly or not good because they weren't, they didn't make money, things like that. And
Yeah, yeah. I mean, lots of cases of these being abandoned after
right.
rediscovered by
Yeah,
their own people.
yeah, or forcibly kind of destroyed or just naturally destroyed in some ways. And so there's a lot of nuance and history to that that's really important to get into. Um, but then again, those systems they never really actually vanish. They're still there. And they're not only there in a lot of rural communities and whatnot, but they're also there like in corporate boardrooms in very interesting ways, right? Where you have all kinds of mutual credit like systems that are moving through Coca-Cola and Walmart or through credit unions or MasterCard and Visa, right? And so those protocols. So this is what was interesting about that chapter. We don't want to get into that yet, but was that going through with these groups, and you remember I was starting with community currency, right? So they had these little paper vouchers. Eventually, we had digital vouchers. Eventually, those were on blockchain. But what they were doing with those vouchers, initially, I was just saying, let's just do big market days, and we just trade. And I saw some groups digitally now, and it was wonderful that we had this digital lens, because some groups were doing 20, 30 times more than everyone else. And it was like, what are they doing? Why are these groups so powerful? And what they were
If
doing
I
was,
could insert here,
yeah,
I will just, this is evolution in action. You know, many experiments. Some succeed, others fail. You actually might not know why,
right,
but you have to have many of them. And then you
yeah,
have to notice the ones that are working. And then you have to focus on them, try to
yeah,
understand them, replicate them, and then repeat. And so what you just described, I just want to flag it, is a variation, selection, replication process. It's a cycle of cultural evolution, is what you just
yeah,
described. So I wanted to name it. Now, please
yeah,
continue.
yeah. No, thank you, David. So these groups were basically using these digital vouchers, think of them like gift cards, and they were putting them into the center, borrowing them, and then using them to account for these mutual aid practices. And actually, when we went and talked to them, they said, "Oh, it looks, I would say, it looks like you're doing something like tabletop banking right now." So, for instance, like one woman would say, "I'm going to take the pot. I need these tokens, and I need to fix my house." And so she would pay everyone in those tokens that came and fixed her house. Okay, she would call them Mweria, is what they would be called, Mweria, and that's this Minka-like practice. And then she would be low on that. To repay her loan, she would do it in kind by working at all the other houses in the neighborhood, and they would rotate. So this is the ROLA, Rotational Labor Association practice. And so they were just using the vouchers as an accounting system for that. And it was useful for them because they had stopped doing that practice around colonization for various reasons we get into. Like they needed money to pay hut taxes, and a few people had tractors, and if you didn't have money, you were considered worthless. And there was a whole bunch of systems, right, that kind of destroyed that practice. But here they had a way to bring it back, and then they were doing that across networks, so several groups could connect with each other as well. So instead of that just being one trust group, because of the transparency of that little digital instrument, they could transfer it between several trust groups, right? So, which is very similar to like, one grandma is in 5 trust groups across the clan, right? And if you need apples, she's going to hook you up. Or if you want to get married, she knows exactly which cousin's uncle or whatever. And so that was really beautiful. And what were they doing? Building houses, building, setting up farms, and we would just see a huge, huge amount of resources being developed. So that was amazing. And then we would go and say, well, what are the rules of this thing? How does it work? What are the basic rules of that? And so first, well, so this is now getting into the protocol, and I think maybe
Yeah,
that's
we're
the next
advancing
section.
through. That's fine.
Yeah. So what was that basic protocol? It was the minimum functionality that you needed to develop this. And of course, there's an enabling environment here, but we can go into that a little bit after. But basically, they would need to curate what was valuable to them, what was a valuable service or an asset that they believed that they needed, that they could offer themselves, right? And so as the community say, okay, like a farming labor, right? That's a commitment that we're valuing here. Mud for the mud walls in the house, like delivery of mud, right? Grains like foods, daycare, right? Storytelling with elders. There would be all kinds of, like palm wine, like all kinds of services
Okay,
people
so
are doing.
these are basically the elements of the local economy
Yeah, yeah,
that we're
yeah.
pulling together, basically.
The stuff people wanted and needed,
What people want.
together. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And then they would say, okay, great. Those are the things that are held in common. So what does that mean in this case? This is an intangible commons, right? This is not, they're not physically storing seeds or anything like that. The storage is all in the belly of your brother, per se. And you're storing instead in memory, traditionally, what people have committed to, right? And those commitments can be expressed in different ways by different communities. In some cases, they are oaths. In some cases, you've got rings, those types of systems where there's very strong witnessed commitments by people. And there's reputation attached to that as well. And now, if I want to take from that, if I want to ask my neighbors for help, right? And here they have committed to supporting over the next season. I'm going to pull those resources, right? But I also put back my own commitments, right? I give my commitment to supporting them in the future. And so this is, when we kind of put this in a way into um, an exchange system, a reciprocal exchange system, we're talking about that endowment space or the space of the commons always having value in it. You don't get to just pull from it. You always do need to put back, but it doesn't need to be in kind in the moment. It's not transactional. It's long-term reciprocity. So you're putting
Yeah.
in your commitment to help others. So
And there's protection. So this is always
yeah,
the cheater, the free rider problem goes up. And
right,
so
right, right.
let's talk a little bit about how these systems are protected against that.
Okay, so let me run through the protocols because we'll get right into that. So you've got curation of what's valuable. You've got relative valuation, which we can come back to. Think of that as kind of putting things into relational value together. It's not setting a price on nature, but it's setting a relative value of service compared to your fellow people, right?
Sure.
And then you have limitation, right? And limitation is basically how much can I pull from the commons without giving back, right? And another way to say it is what's our balance of those services? How much, how many David Sloan Wilsons can be put into this pool, right? To pull out other stuff before the pool only has David Sloan Wilson in it now, right? And now the whole community is at risk because we're all completely holding this debt of yours, right? So what does that balance look like throughout a season, throughout cycles of this? And the typical work week, would be a 4-day week instead of a 7-day week like we have. 3 of those days would be just this practice. So 3 days of a week, you're going to your neighbors or they're coming to yours to do mueria in cycles. Usually with like your 7 closest neighbors, maybe extended out to 20 with bigger groups. And then your fourth day is a mandatory rest day. Everyone must rest. They wouldn't accept a two-class society where some people are serving the people who are resting, right? Everyone needs to rest that day. So that would be this work week. And now if you were taking from everyone in the community, David's gotten help from everyone in the community, but he's not offering help in return. So his debts are piling up, right? He's losing reputation. The most extreme case of this kind of graduated sanctions, the extreme sanction here would be they would take a stick, a ceremonial stick, and they're not going to beat you with it, David. Don't worry. They're going to stick it on your lawn or in front of your house, and it's got this ribbons on it. And basically, it means this person's no longer invited into the commons. They can't borrow anymore, right? Until David brings a black sheep and a white chicken and hosts a party, right? And so you would repay your loan in kind in some various ways, and that would be kind of like the most extreme way. Ideally, this would have happened way before that. You would have maybe done double the work another day, or
Oh
your
yeah,
family
this is
would have
so
stepped
this
in.
in
Yeah,
Australian terms, this
yeah,
is graduated sanctions.
yeah, 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 exactly, exactly. And so that's, like there's something really important about that because in a typical banking situation, if you're borrowing $1,000 from me, I'm holding your debt right now, right? So you've got $1,000 and I'm holding David's debt. Well, what can I do with that debt? Right? What do I, as a bank? Well, I'm gonna, call the police on you, or try to, like force some other collateral bearer to pay you out or something. But within a community group, if the community's holding David's debt, well, that debt can be spread across the whole community. We're not stuck in a silo. It's not a bilateral contract. It's now become a multilateral contract. Yeah. So
Awesome.
that's the three main protocols, and then you have exchange. So it's curation, valuation, limitation, and exchange. And exchange is kind of there as you can think of that in a way as like business logic. Matthew Slater would always use those terms where it's like what's the mechanism now for actual transmission and reciprocity? Like, are you doing this asynchronously as a marketplace? Are you doing it synchronously as like a ritual custom together? Do you have like a jubilee at the end of the year where you settle debts? What are those various kind of what's the business case in a sense, the business logic? How does it happen? And so there's a lot of breathing room within all of that to express curation in many ways. And you could also
Yeah, there's
curate.
your basically
Yeah, yeah,
implementation, how lots of
there
elbow
you go.
room for tinkering with your arrangements, basically is.
Absolutely, absolutely. But at least it gives me a frame and a language to be able, like, okay, where can I see those four things in action? And then, what's the enabling environment around those things? You need some kind of a memory system, right? You got to remember stuff that's happened, right? You need some kind of a authentication system. You need to know whose commitments are whose. Like I know, you're David by face, maybe I know your family. You need some kind of rule following or execution system, right? Like once you've made an agreement, how do you actually follow those rules? What does it take? And those three things, and minimal, are also what are on most decentralized ledgers now. Like a blockchain provides a memory system, an authentication system through cryptography, and a rule following system, an execution layer for agreements or contracts. So that's where we've gone in terms of expressing some of this in the digital realm. And I think that's the
Yeah.
next.
So now we're at the digital ecosystems, is that right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Okay. And then a path forward. We'll finish up with your reflections and then we'll segue into
Yeah.
practice.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's probably I might have skipped through a section of just, like taking those protocols and looking at various structures, like you know, um, looking at organizations like BlackRock, right? So like you can have organizations that are doing curation, right? They're curating massive piles of assets, right? They're certainly doing some relative valuation of those things. They're certainly limiting access. In fact, they might be trying to enclose such that you can only use their pool, their resources, right?
Yeah.
And and the business logic behind that is incredibly extractive. So like if you look at like predatory cooperation, for instance, or like military cooperation, you can find these same structures, right? So you can say, well, this military unit, certainly they're doing some curation, valuation, limitation, and exchange inside their platoon or something like this. But then they're going and killing these other guys, right? And so there's a little bit, and maybe we come back to this in terms of kind of parasitic or predatory behavior, where when do these pools connect to each other? And so that's maybe like the tail end of this protocol is to say if you've got a pool here and then you've got another pool over here, if they have some commitment in common, if there's some
Yeah. Yeah. The
there can be a
pro-sociality
bridge.
has to extend. This is where, for
Yeah,
some members of our audience, multi-level selection comes in big time.
there we go.
And the idea is that first of all, there's what I call the perverse alchemist that turns gold into lead, that cooperation at one level can turn into disruptive competition at higher
Yeah,
levels. And so that's always a problem. That's the way the world has been since it began in nature and in human society. And we specifically need to guard against that. So to be pro-social obligates us to be pro-social between groups, not just within groups. And when it comes to
yeah,
that, the same principles apply. It's scale independent, so that there's a conceptual elegance, basically. So as we build our groups of groups and groups of groups and groups, we have to
yeah,
be cooperative all the way up the scale and mindful of that. Because if we're not,
yeah.
then the perverse alchemist will kick in. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so having some protocol language around, identifying cooperation for me, like that's that in some, you could say holonic or also fractal in a way across those different layers, right? So your agent in this case that's able to express a commitment. Who is that agent? Well, can that be a group? Could it be a family? Could it be an individual? Could it be a business, right? What's the nature of that group that can express a promise, express
yeah,
intention?
if I could, I hope I'm not coming in too often here, but this is the concept of polycentric governance from the
Right.
Ostromian framework,
Yeah.
which very simply, life consists of many spheres of activity.
Yeah.
Each sphere has an optimal scale. Good governance requires finding the optimal scale for each sphere and
Mhm.
appropriately coordinating among the spheres. Polycentric governance, back to you.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And so you've got these multi levels of types of agents interacting in an ecosystem. You say, okay, great. How are they actually interacting? And if you can see this opportunity for curation of value happening within a group, right? And relative valuation, limitation on exchange with that, well, that's a very healthy thing for that unit to be doing, right? It allows them to identify what they need, how to identify what's the relative values of those things they need, right? Put them in relationship, just like a mycorrhizal fungi, and it enables them to continually exchange those within each other. So it's like a little bit like a metabolic metabolic protocol. And then if that unit, whether it's an individual or group, is connected to common commitments, resources across different groups, it starts to form a super group, right? A super cluster that has also those same rules. And it may have, there may be phase transitions and different rules at different stages, but it fundamentally needs those four things would be the conjecture, right? Otherwise, it's completely going to fall apart. And so that's what we,
Yeah,
looking in the blockchain space, that's what we're tracking in these groups. So you'll see microclusters connected to larger clusters, connected to larger clusters, and ultimately at each different scale, they're still doing the same protocol. And
yeah,
that's kind of the
yeah.
hope of, protocol scaling as language, right? The language becomes
Mm.
more valuable the more people speak it.
Maybe this would be a good opportunity to show the social network imaging that you've done,
Sure,
which I
sure.
find so evocative, just artistically evocative, in addition to how else it functions. But that
Yeah,
would be a good
wonderful.
time to do that.
So this is the public website that we've created as a foundation, and basically what you can do here is express commitments. Everything's free on this website. You can create essentially things like gift cards. You can create pools and you can create reports. And there's kind of an intrinsic marketplace in here that we're pulling out as well. But there's a few visualizations like maps and visualizations on this is basically a visualization on um, exchange density, within these groups. So what you'll see, each dot here is a business, a group, or an individual. Most of these are individuals. This is probably 80% across Kenya and maybe 20% the rest of the world. And each dot is connected to other dots in proximity based on how much they actually exchange with each other. And so I'll give an example here. You can open this up as well on your phone or whatever, viz.sarafu.network. And so you'll see clusters like this. So like this cluster, this would be in a village, Nyalgunga. I think that's over in Western Kenya. And each member is doing this traditional practice where they're exchanging their commitment amongst each other as a group. And then they're connected out into other groups. You'll see through these like
Is this
nodes
based on
here.
real data? So there's some density of
Yeah,
interactions and that gets fed into the
exactly.
system. And then so
Yeah.
this is not just imaginary. This is actually based on real data
Yeah.
that gets updated frequently. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah, this is about the last month of data. And we go back on with actual like live data until about Y2K, or no, that's not true.
So
About
you could actually show
nine
this through time as an evolving
yeah,
network.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And the data is published on UK data archives. And it's all anonymized and whatnot, and gone through ethical screening and whatnot. So um yeah, so the idea that this is a pool that's connecting these various groups together, you'll see where these groups are connecting. And that's this idea of like, having common commitments or commitments for resources between groups acts as a bridge. And essentially this doesn't look terribly different than a credit system on Visa or MasterCard, interestingly, right? What you have on Visa and MasterCard is a whole bunch of banks, right, that have a debt history for each individual, right? And then you have an agreement amongst those banks to share credit lines amongst each other, right? It's only that they're only using one type of an asset. So what's different about, if you think about this as a credit union or a bank, it's just that you're opening up to all kinds of resources that can be committed, and you're enabling interoperability between those. So, see if I can open the map here and show you as well. And this is what's nice about blockchain right now. And there may be a million iterations of this, but the blockchain is essentially a little consensus layer, right? What it does is it provides, oops, it provides a memory system. So this is mostly in Kenya. You'll see a lot of activity here. And for all the activities that we do, you'll also see reports of what people are doing in those activities. You can zoom in there. You can see what's happening in Ukraine right now. So Toloka in Ukraine is the exact same tradition of ancient Ukrainians doing this practice. You'll find groups in Italy doing trade for olive oil and labor. You can also, there's a lot of groups that are also integrating stuff like what are called stable coins or national currency into these pools as well. So you'll end up with sort of this range of what can be pooled, what kinds of resources. And we work a lot in refugee camps as well, where the Red Cross will come into a pool and say, we're willing to put funds into that pool. Those funds then get pulled out by commitments, so they get borrowed, if you will, and what's left there are a bunch of relational commitments between the service providers around the refugee camp, and they can still continue to trade with each other and exchange, on credit with each other, even when the money is not there. So this kind of, I think of it as like heroin to methadone kind of, de-addiction,
Yeah, okay.
to, yeah, yeah.
Okay, what's going on in the United States?
Um, there's a whole bunch of well, one of the biggest groups that we've worked with there is Cooperation Jackson in
I'm familiar with it. Yeah,
yeah, Jackson, Mississippi. And in that case, we're working with mostly small businesses. And what the group is doing as like a cooperative is they're creating a resource pool. They're identifying resources that they have, right? So that is like open space or rental space or vehicles or tools or trainings. Um,
sure.
right? So they're creating that space where they say, okay, these are all, think of them as like things like gift cards and bus tickets. So here's this virtual space of gift cards and bus tickets that they have as the cooperative already. And then they're going out to community members, like someone who's, let's say, selling ice cream, and they're saying, would you like to express what you're doing in the form of a gift card? Can we make you a gift card? And so that business over here says, yes, I'm going to make a gift card. They create gift cards usually denominated in dollars, so dollars worth of ice cream, right? Just like you would get a physical gift card. And then the group says, okay, great, you've got your gift card. You could use it as you would a gift card, with clients or loyalty points or however you want to use gift cards. But you can also use it as credit, right, to get anything within this marketplace, right? So they're going to give that ice cream salesman a credit line. They say, you put in your gift cards into the commons, and you can pull out an equal value, right? Remember that, relative valuation is very important here, of other assets that are in there. There could be money in there. There could be, car rental. So what happens is he takes out the asset, he uses it, he goes and, uses that as a gift card for his, car mechanic. He gets the work done. Now he's in debt to the community. He has, reputational debt. But in this case, it's a, formalized credit obligation. You could call it legally, right? It's an IOU. His gift card is in the pool, like a library, and you say, okay, anyone else in the community now can also borrow that, right? So someone else can come in and say, I'm going to exchange these to pull out his gift card, and I'm going to go over to him and get some ice cream. Now he's paid off his debt. And now he has credit again in the network, right? And that credit can grow based on trust in the network, the amount of, essentially leverage he has. How much can he borrow from the network before he pays back? And so it's better to think about these things instead of, almost, I've had to wipe my brain of community currency and alternative monetary systems and think of them more like little banks, little credit unions, little common pooled resources, right? That people have access to, right? It's actually a much healthier and more functional frame than having to think about everything as money.
Yeah. So I make a distinction. I say that we have to operate in two capacities. One as designers of whole systems, and two as participants in the systems that we design. Designers of whole systems compared to the participants in the systems that we design. As
Yeah.
designers, we have to have the whole system in mind, as we've been talking about right now.
Mm.
As participants, we don't necessarily. And so I just wonder if that distinction is meaningful for you, and how you go about. Of course, we've been talking about creating the whole system, but then when you have your trainers and you're trying to get something going in a given community, um, how much,
Yeah.
how do they go about it? Basically, interesting people to participate without necessarily having to know about the whole system, which is, of course, complicated and challenging and uh,
Yeah.
and all of that.
I mean, in Africa and a lot of South America, the most viral system that has spread across, the continent in the last 20 years is called the Village Savings and Loan Association, right? Which is kind of a tabletop bank. And those guys who go and That's their essentially job, is to go and train communities to do this stuff, and nobody's paying them. It used to be Catholic Relief Services and Care International, but they're long gone. But these guys are still there. It's still spreading, even of word of mouth. And what they do is they go into a community and they say, look, I'm going to help you pool your resources together. Traditionally, now, I mean, traditionally, recent tradition is only with money. So they would have a little box, a little lock box. And that guy who's training these guys, he would usually have one of the keys on that lockbox. There'd be like three keys, three padlocks on this little metal box. Everyone put your money in there, right? Here are the rules. Everyone's gonna chip in, chip in. You get to borrow X amount. There's fees if you don't pay back on time. These, and a lot of these systems, they would kind of burst, boom. Often they're doing things like 10% interest, which is really hard to do. But anyways, these guys still, it was still super viral because it was a common pooled resource practice, right? People could borrow from that common pool. They found it super useful. They did not want to store the money at home, right? Yada yada. And it was and so basically, like, piggybacking on that methodology that has spread so much. I mean, millions of these groups across the continent. We do pretty much the same thing. So we have trainers of trainers that kind of go out there. They usually are based in some communities. They might work with two or three groups or even up to 10 groups. They have that group first do what we call a kind of a visionary approach. And I think it fits well with a lot of your pro-social practices, where they're identifying what is their vision as an individual in a community. What is it they're trying
Yeah,
to
that's
reach
that's
within
a
the year?
CDP1 for the
Exactly.
Australians out there. That's their core design
Yep.
principle number one, strong sense of
Yep.
identity and purpose.
Yes. And then we look at different types of resources. So we go across, like the Catholic Relief Services, like 6 resource categories. So like their social resources, who do they belong to? We look at skills and time. We look at natural resources, infrastructure, economic resources, or financial resources, and governance, like voice and whatnot. So we do an asset mapping, resource mapping, right? And then we basically have this kind of structural tension, kind of gap analysis, where we say, what's the difference between where you'd like to be and where you are right now? What's the tension there between the two?
Yeah,
And
I'm
that's,
seeing so much convergence with other
yeah,
successful methods. So it's really a pleasure for me to hear this and to note the convergence with other people with
yeah.
whom I'm working. So keep going.
Yeah, yeah. And then the question arises, okay, well, we got these assets here as a group, but they're not really owned by any one person. It's a whole bunch of people's assets. We all want to reach here. How do we coordinate these resources in a fair way to go from this reality where we are right now and bring it up, release the tension, bring it up to where we want to be, right? And then keep doing that, right? And that idea of how do we coordinate resources. We don't have necessarily have enough money half of the time, and usually, like almost 90% of the time, depending on where we're working, we someone will have a story of how their grandma used to do it, and that's where we'll find the word in that culture for the Rotational Labor Association. And even in Mississippi, when we're working in Jackson, Mississippi, they would talk about the lottery. Their original lottery was a pool of resources that everyone committed to, and they took turns borrowing from it, right? And they would keep, that. So those concepts are deep within almost all cultures in the world, like the barn raising, right? Like, how do we actually put our resources together to reach where we're going? That little, so that's the little mechanism, the functional mechanisms that gets them here, to there, right? That's how they would coordinate their resources. They would curate what they've got, they find valuable. They would give them relative value. They would set limits on reciprocity, right? And then they would enable exchange, So I'm going to host this. This is our next step, right? Those are your like your smart action steps now, to get up to your vision. Yeah.
Yeah. So I talk a lot about bottom up meets enlightened top down. And what I mean by that is theoretically, in principle, this could take place entirely in a bottom up fashion because, I mean, here's all these resources lying
Mm.
around in an uncoordinated fashion. You don't need an external input of resources. The resources are there within the community, and it's a matter of coordinating them. In principle, that could just that could just take place just by people deciding to do it. In practice, and I'd love to know that that was true, by the way, that just like, a match to Tinder, that just, it just It just it takes place. But in practice, it seems that often something else is needed. Something that's providing resources or a backbone organization or somebody who's
Yeah,
being paid to do it, or and leadership also. This is
yeah,
very distributed, but that's not to say that strong leadership has no place. And in fact, strong leadership very often does have a place when it's of the servant leader variety, and the
yeah,
leader is functioning as a coordinator of
yeah,
community
yeah,
processes. So, speak to me about
yeah.
this concept of bottom up and needing, or at least greatly
Yeah.
benefiting from some kind of enlightened top down.
Yeah. Well, so in the book as well, I talk about kind of a sister tradition to the Mueria, this, rotational labor, and that is this governance tradition, and they call it Dome here on the coast. And really, and across most of Africa, it's kind of the word for gathering, and that would be depending on the culture and depending on the issue, would be a gathering of households of elders that are coming together. What they're doing at those gatherings is one narrative and sense making. There's storytelling, there's dancing, there's food. Once the kids have kind of gone to bed, then there's deliberation, and a lot of that is in seeding, right? So seeding as in making commitments explicit, right? Make it clear to everybody. Dealing with debts, right? Not leaving water under the bridge per se, and planning, right? What are we actually all going to do together? And that process of seeding, like you don't have a pool with nothing in it. It doesn't, there's nothing to trade. There's no, how can you be reciprocal or borrow something when there's nothing there, right? So what what's that first step? And this is where leadership comes in, is if, this elder says, I'm going to provide 5 goats over this season, or I'm going to, my family is going to provide this labor. And I also need a lot of other support around the community. I know you guys all need that too. Someone needs to step in and provide and seed that system. And
So
and that can be
that's
done.
where like a philanthropic organization could come in and say, rather than give
Yeah.
a grant with no return, it would be to give a
Yeah.
grant to seed this, basically.
Absolutely. And that's, we've been working a lot with the Mustard Seed Trust over the years, and they've recently ended as an organization. And some of the last of their funding, what they have about 60 grantees over the years, really amazing projects all around the world. And what they're doing actively right now is saying, let's put the rest of our funds into a pool that the our curation, they've already curated a lot in terms of good projects, that each one of those projects can borrow from that and repay in kind to each other. So in other words, composting the money into relational economics in those systems. And I've seen that be extremely powerful. And again, it's, you're in sort of like your heroin to methadone kind of thing. It's like we're in a super addiction dependency on money right now, right? How do we turn that dependency on money into relationship, into healthy relationship, at many levels?
Yeah, that's perfect. Well said. Here's another question, Will, I want to make sure to ask that if you look at how people perceive this psychologically, how they experience it, it's possible that all of this could take place and people in their own minds are like Homo economicus. They're thinking about what's in it for them and so on and so forth. Or it could equally be the opposite, that by creating these strong communities, people become communitarian and they become genuinely other oriented. They basically they revere the community that they built, and the whole spiritual mindset of regarding things as sacred and worshiping
Yeah.
them and so on could come into play.
Mhm.
Either of those are possible when we look at these inner meaning systems that motivate the outer action. What actually takes place, or what range of things actually takes place when we create these communities? Do people become like super communitarian? Which that's my guess, but just like to
Yeah.
hear your experience.
I mean, I in this village I live in here, I'll show you out the window here. Um, we've got about 10 of these practices going on simultaneously every week. And the community just loves it, and it's been in a, this kind of state of everyone's getting to know each other, everyone trusts each other, everyone's in relationship with each other. The lineage, like the term ubuntu is to become a person, ubu to become, and unto a person. And that's the same Bantu language group. In Swahili, you say utu is humanity. And you're not a person unless you're in relationship with other people. Otherwise, you're just a human. You're of the species, but you're not a people, right? So peopling, becoming a person, that's the process of it. And so you identify as I'm of this people. In fact, like the group pronouns for all of these tribes was the name of these practices, right? So you weren't just doing a mueria. That is a group of people that you see is a mueria, right? That is the name, so like as, like a flock of birds, you would say a mueria of the Giriyama clan, you know.
Okay.
And so a lot of these,
That's a nice,
yeah,
a murder of crows, a flock of
yeah,
birds.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, exactly. So I think that's, I think that's we're getting towards something that feels like native habitat in a way socially, in terms of safety and trust within the community. And things like providing security, knowing your neighbors, knowing that you can call on someone when you need help, the insurance, really basic insurance. I mean, these are
Does a lot of this
these are insurance
reciprocity
needs.
take place outside the formal system? Because I mean, the system that you're
Yeah.
describing is quite formal, but I can imagine there's just people in a spirit of being other oriented. They
Oh
just do
yeah,
stuff without
absolutely.
being asked, and it's not
Yeah,
even part of the accounting, probably. It's just a
absolutely.
general spirit of
Yeah.
prosociality.
We see a lot of groups that sort of start in the system and then they'll disappear on the ledger in between each other, and then we only see them appear on the ledger between other groups. That's really interesting. So I think, like how much do they actually need to account with their phones or things like this? Hopefully not much and not forever. And really that's you're seeing the boundary of where the trust is or where they need accountability, right?
It'd be nice to be able to track that so that they still are visible in the system rather than disappearing. When in
But
fact
it's okay.
they've
Yeah.
really gone
Yeah.
to a more mature stage.
Yeah, they become more of a unit together and they don't need to, we don't need to track every kiss I give my wife or something like that, I
Is
mean,
there is
yeah.
there an is there an explicit comparison with the community as an organism, or perhaps even as a beehive or a termite colony? Is it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the term kaya is similar to the term like oikos in Greek, um, and that would be oikos or ecos, which is the origin of ecosystem, right? So kaya from the Mijikenda tribes I live around, it means a few things. It means home, it means society. It basically is the organism of us, right? And it would extend from like one household is a kaya, but also a whole society of multiple clans can be called a kaya. And also the place where you are and all the resources there is also the kaya, right? So this term kaya was like identifying the organism. You're of that kaya, right? You are in that social organism, and that's your home, right? You are, and you belong there. You're safe there. You have food there. You have resources there. It's home, home, literally the word home, right? And I think that's really just, how do we make ourselves at home? How do we feel safe? How do we know that we can ask for help? Basic, insurance kind of mechanisms. And that's been the tradition or the transition for me is out of transactional currency systems or monetary systems, which is really like the Roman lineage of Juno Moneta and money, into relational economics and common pooled resources and feeling security as a community.
Yeah. So let me finish up with three questions and then ask you to add anything you want. You can get the final word. Um, I'll just I'll just ask my three questions and then you can all at once, and then you can answer them in turn. Number one, uh, what would a community in a bottom-up fashion, a group of people wanted to do this? They don't have a lot of resources other than these resources that they're organizing. So how would a group of people um, start doing this in a bottom-up fashion? Question number
Yeah.
two, how would a top-down organization, such as a philanthropic organization or a microfinance organization or something like that, or a city government or some organization that's basically heavily resourced, could get how does how would they get things started? And then number three, how to start using this technology that you built, basically, because you showed us your website and you could go on, it's all open source and so on and so forth. And so, how would either one of those, a bottom-up community or an enlightened top-down organization,
Yeah.
actually begin using the tools that you've been constructing?
Yeah. Thanks, David. Um, so for bottom up, I think, one thing is not to put yourself in in a situation where you say this thing must transact and be a currency system. If instead you think of it as an insurance, you'd say, well, what can I offer, within this community? What services can I offer? And what can everyone else offer in this community? And when can we tap into those offers fairly? Right. So if within your community you say, look, I'm going to offer, I like to offer some chess lessons or exercise or some, group activity, and that those offers can be pooled to that can be articulated in a clear way. They can be pooled together, and that the community members can get access to those when they need them, right? Um, it, in the back of my mind, I'm still in kind of community currency mode, where you would say, well, unless people are actively doing those every single day, you don't have an exchange system. It's like, well, that's fine. Just take a deep breath and just say, okay, look, how do we actually pool our resources together for when we need them?
Could
And
you run through
then,
that again? Could you run through that again with a group of
sure.
businesses? So I'm thinking of like a
Yeah, okay.
bioregion, and
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
businesses in the bioregion. They want to get involved in this. They're
yeah,
not all the businesses; they're a subset, but they have and so they want to do this. And the agent here is a local business. So
right.
could you just go
Yeah,
through it
okay.
again with
Yeah,
that more specific example?
it's almost easier in that case because most local businesses already have well-defined offerings, right? So
Exactly, that's right.
i- if I'm
And
a
needs. I mean,
needs,
you
yeah,
said, we
yeah,
have a warehouse. I mean,
yeah, very
or
good.
we have vehicles, or so on and so forth.
Exactly. Yeah. So those local businesses are asked to define their products. Those could be goods or services, whatever they have to offer, right? So if it's dollars worth of, and basically make gift cards, right? That's sort of the beginning of it. Make a gift card. If you want to even make them on paper, just define your service in such a way that if I were to buy that gift card or you were to give it to me, how, that you would honor it when it came back to you, right? And that's, those are normal business contract. They're, under contract law. If you make a legitimate gift card signed by you and, someone else has it, you need to honor that thing, right? So this is that's kind of a step one. I mean, there can be some, pre-steps to this, but if a business can make a gift card, that's a really good first step, right? So if a business is saying, I'm going to offer warehousing space, well, they say, okay, great. This gift card is worth dollars of warehouse space per month. Okay. And let's say warehouse space costs $50 a month. Okay, great. So this voucher is a discount on that space, right? And so if David, you have it, you could come and redeem it with me as part of your payment for that warehouse space. Okay, great. Gift cards. Very, very simple. That's, nothing new about that. And then the second stage to this is, okay, we've got a bunch of people with gift cards. How can we create a pool now? How can we create a common pool resource, which is an intangible pool that includes these offers for resources? Um, and to do that, one way to do it, I mean, the simplest way to do it is you as an individual in that community go and say, look, um, I'm willing to put in this resource into the pool. Will you also put this into the pool? And so that would be like a self seeded group. So if everyone's willing to, let's say, quote unquote, donate into that pool, $10 worth of their services, right? And then each one of those businesses also gets borrowing access to that entire pool, then now they have credit amongst each other. That might be very hard to do, but that's how you would self-seed that group. And it could be that an individual goes in there and says, I'm willing to put in first, right? I'm willing to put in my services first. I'm going to let you come in and borrow those, right? As long as you put in your own assets into that pool. And so there's some bootstrapping there, either as a group, if you're a church group or like a fellowship group, or collectively at a mosque together, like you have some trust with that group, you're willing to self-seed. Otherwise, it takes an individual to do that. And that gets into your second point, right? How do you do this from the top down? Well, from the top down, you have a bunch of resources. right? And if you're willing to seed those to produce that network, well, that's a strong first step forward, right? You're showing people that they can put in their resources to pull out, what's in that
What would
pool.
a community foundation do? So community foundations are already kind of in that position, but what would they do that they wouldn't otherwise do in this system?
Yeah. I mean, ideally, this is just kind of articulating what they already do. So if they're collectively managing a fund, let's say of dollars, one thing is to say, well, can we extend that fund to hold a bunch of other services? And maybe they already do that as well, right? And so as a group, they're holding some assets. They might be adding different types of assets, like these gift cards, into that pool, and then they're offering access to that based on need in the community. And it doesn't have to be tit for tat. You could have certificates for the local kids to access that pool up to some degree, right? Up to some limit, right? And so it doesn't have to be terribly different at all than that. It's just a matter of saying, well, can we protocolize that? And can we also connect that community pool to the next community pool, right? With limits between them. So you create federations across those. And like the long, long tail version of this is that the actual commons is not big pools that are owned by a bunch of people together. It's actually the network of in between all the pools. That's the actual commons, the fully intangible commons. That's not owned, can't be owned. It's unownable because it's really the network in between all of these agent, objects with each other. So yeah, so the benefit of a larger foundations or even a community foundation is to say, we are going to create something like a public library of assets that people can borrow those assets, right? They can be borrowed based on these criteria, whether or not it's certification of membership or it's injecting other assets of equal value into that pool, right? Promises for future labor, right? And then creating that system where you have a community credit card now that you can use across, the whole community, and it tracks your accountability across that relational network.
Awesome. Okay,
Yeah.
so I want to go a little bit more into the weeds here. And how do we actually start using that social network tool so
Yeah.
that we could actually visualize what we're doing? A little bit of advice there for anyone who wants to follow up on that.
Yeah. Okay. So on grassecon.substack.com, you'll see a call to commenting. So we have a public call twice a week. It's actually coming up in an hour from now. And so that's one way to there's kind of community of practice around that. And happy to we have a lot of people that can come and give talks depending on where you are to just set that up with you. But really in the simplest form, you're basically just saying again, you're creating digital gift cards, right? For people within your network. And then you're creating pools that curate value and limits exchange of those gift cards, right? And the actual website, so serapho.network, it's totally open source. Ultimately, what we want is more groups copying that website and making their own version of it,
Yeah.
so that everything doesn't have to come through us. But in the meantime, it's free to use. And there's some caveats right now. We'll have something like a simple Google login, username and password, but for right now, you either need like a little QR code, which you can get on the website, we call it a paper wallet, or you need a blockchain wallet to use it right now, because we're using blockchain on the back end. That that'll get simpler and simpler. Like in another 3 months, you won't need that. So your login to that website is actually your little, cryptographic key, your blockchain key. And so we use like Rabby, rabby.io as your wallet, or MetaMask. There's a bunch of options. Or in some communities, they print these, or they print little QR codes. And that's actually the cheapest in most places around that aren't using the SMS feature phones like we do in Kenya. But like in Colombia, for instance, they print out little QR codes, they laminate those, and that's it. That's all you need. So it's getting simpler and simpler to use, but you get on there, you have an account, and your account is basically a public address that's like your PO box and a password. Okay.
Okay.
And then inside that you can create a voucher. And you own it. They're all yours. Like if you create some David Slim Wilson, some DSWs, you could say, I'm going to create 1,000 DSWs. Each one's worth $1 of consulting time. And you could say exactly how you want to redeem those, like what products that you offer. Say, okay, a 2 hour talk is going to be, minimum, you know, 100 DSWs, and people could buy those and give them to the grandma, and the grandma could say, I need some help, David, and you could, honor that commitment. And then secondly, you could go on there and say, I want to make a pro-social pool of all the pro-social, the trainers that are out there. And so each one of those trainers can put some of their vouchers into the pool. They can all borrow from each other, but you could also allow the public to come in and say, we want to add dollars to that pool in order to buy training from that entire network. And if I have tokens from that pool or vouchers, I could use them with any of the trainers, right? So you're creating
Okay.
a network, and that would be kind of like you know, uh, a network of people offering very similar services, but ideally, you could diversify that pool into many different types of services, and you could also give ownership of that pool over to the network itself. So this is where, modern language, they like to call them DAOs, like decentralized autonomous organizations. So you could have a voting system. There's a lot of ways we do this. We've been starting to use a thing called gardens.fund, where you can actually create little voting systems, different types of voting systems for those as well. So there's a whole realm you can get into in terms of governance of those. Um,
All
yeah.
right. Awesome. Okay. Well, now back to your book. If someone wants to read the book, they go to the Grassroots Economics website, and then you can download the book for free. And everything is open source and very pro-social of you. And of course, you can donate and so on and so forth. So, anything else you want to say about just back to the book, and then any final word that you'd like to end our conversation?
Um, we've just got a French translation of the book as well. There's an audiobook, and there's about to be a Spanish version as well. So if you know people in those languages, let them know. Um, and just in general, I think that, if we're successful at all, then, these kind of language and basic functionality are things that are going to be useful to, spread commons and identify commoning going on already, and just provide some functional mechanisms around that. So I'm excited that we can, you know, keep testing and keep, learning this language, and learning from this kind of work together.
Well, I told this to you, Will. I'll tell it to our audience that a colleague of mine who's a historian said, first there was the age of empire, then there was the age of nation states. What's next? The age of networks. And
Yeah,
so I just love the concept of this. And this is, of course, the fabric of democracy. I think the more that this spreads, it is so inherently democratic that it cannot help but create true democracy as opposed to just the superficial kind that's
yeah,
being tested so much around the world. So that, I mean, I think then grassroots is the perfect word for that. So
yeah.
so all good, and I'm look forward to sharing this far and wide, and working with you in the future. I hope many opportunities open up.
Yeah, likewise, likewise. I think there's, something around the democracy of forkability and this stuff too, because, if a government or, feudal system can trap you into a particular pool, and you're not free anymore to connect directly with people, right? Well, that's a big problem, right? So having language and functional mechanism, and identifying that need, and how to actually create networks, of create commons, is something that's it's a little bit of a lost language. So it's almost so lost that we've had to sort of, go out and do taxonomy to really just even see what was going on, and so now it's just like, oh, right, it's that thing, that, oh, right, all of our, exchange mechanisms are now being forced through a particular coin of the Romans called money, right? Like, oh, we can identify that as colonization of domination now, right? Like, so I think there's some beautiful ability to kind of see the ability to cooperate again, and find a path and mechanism forward. And I think you've done a huge amount of that as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and I guess I am going to claim the last word in the following sense. One thing that's really so uh, optimistic about this is it does not require permission.
Yeah.
You don't have to get permission to
Yeah.
do this. You can just do it. That's what it means to be grassroots. And then also, I think that if if this particular version of it is not exactly what you're in a position to do, then there's other forms of forming into
Yeah,
groups and pro-sociality and employing these principles that don't have any of these trappings, but nevertheless, what they are people getting together in cooperative arrangements and
yeah,
um, and making the most out of um, groups appropriately structured, meaningful and appropriately structured groups. But
yeah,
um, um, small is not automatically beautiful. There has to be appropriate structure of one source
yeah.
or or another. And so all this is so great. All right, well, all good. And then hopefully we'll see a lot of each other in the future.